The company Data East released over 100 different arcade games from their beginnings in 1978 up until their bankruptcy in 1997. And while at times their titles were a bit derivative of other hit games, they also often had some fun, offbeat vibes behind their ideas, and sometimes they would really crank up the absurdity to new heights. Which brings us to Trio the Punch, released in 1990, arguably their peak of unhinged chaotic energy. Trio the Punch Never Forget Me was developed internally at Data East and produced by the same team behind the wildly creative classics Karnov and Atomic Runner Chelnov. And with Trio the Punch, these would form into a trilogy known as the Dekoge Trio. Interestingly enough, this was originally planned to be a Sugo-Roku game, or in other words, a kind of board game experience. Types of Sugo-Roku in its classic tabletop forms are comparable to backgammon or Chutes and Ladders, with more contemporary video game versions evolving into something more like Coldcept or Mario Party. But as you can quickly tell upon starting up this game, the core concept shifted entirely into a side-scrolling brawler with a wild sense of humor, poking fun at various tropes and other Data East characters, much like other silly self-referential spoof games like Parodius or Choaniki. You can pick from 3 different characters: Santos, the tough guy, a jock armed with a sandbag, or Kamakura-kun, the ninja, armed with a dagger and throwing stars, and Rozusabu, the swordsman, who can use a sword, torch, or morning star. They all have secondary sub-weapons as well, and both your main and sub-weapons can be upgraded by your sensei if you can get lucky with the spinning wheel in between levels. Cha-cha-cha! And the game's 35 stages are structured a bit strangely, where you'll often need to collect a certain number of yellow hearts dropped by specific enemies, with the stage screen wrapping endlessly until you've found them all. And at that point, you'll spawn a few stronger enemies to defeat, or potentially a boss. Or in some cases, the level itself is just one single boss fight. And probably a weird one. Even right out of the gate, the boss of level 1 is a giant Karnov statue being carried by a bunch of tiny little Karnovs. Yeah, this is my jam right here. And the craziness just continues from there, as you go on to fight some weird pink sheep thing, which you actually end up controlling in the next stage, or you'll also eventually have to battle with the giant foot, or maybe Chelnov sporting a giant hammer, or Colonel Sanders with a flying chicken brain thing, a giant Maneki Neko, these big blob mech monstrosities, and it's really just an absolute onslaught of unpredictable hilarity as you beat your way through a wide range of locations with no plot explanation whatsoever. And if you can stay sane enough to see this through to the end, the final stage has you destroy a few innocent creatures running around. Such cruelty. Only to reveal some sinister and mysterious force beneath the ground. Win-win indeed. So there isn't a ton of depth to this gameplay-wise, but whether you credit feed your way through, or if you're bold enough to attempt a 1-credit clear, or even a speedrun, it's really a blast if you appreciate this kind of deranged humor and can deal with a bit of jank. There are still some challenging sections at times, as continuing does restart your stage progress, so it's not a completely casual stroll the entire game, and you may have to develop some safe strats at times, especially if you get some unlucky roulette spins that can downgrade your gear. Regardless, most players can likely get through this in less than an hour, and what a brain-melting hour it is if you can get down with this irreverent humor and bathe yourself in all of this Data East goodness. Beyond the original arcade version, it has seen a few re-releases, one being on the PlayStation 2 as part of the Oretachi Gessen Zoku series, although it's kind of a slipshod emulated port there with some frame rate issues. So I'd say that's more of a cool collector's piece. It also got a mobile phone version released by Gmode in Japan, but currently the most accessible official way to get this would have to be the Arcade Archives release from 2022 on the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. The only problem there, however, is they use the Japanese version, so you will miss out on the wacky translations. So I gotta say, the worldwide arcade ROM is still the ultimate way to experience Trio the Punch. And I hope you enjoyed the video today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.
Robodemons.
I've probably fallen off the deep end while researching and scavenging through piles of dusty old NES games, but there's just something special about scraping the bottom of the barrel and discovering something that reaffirms your love for the hobby and simply makes you smile. Somehow finding the fun within something hastily made on a shoestring budget, a raw and unpolished mess, yet still able to capture a feeling of childlike wonder beneath the layers of jank. For me, this one really unlocked memories of weekend game rentals when you didn't always know what you'd get beyond the often misleading box art, but that's the one game you got for a couple days and you were gonna play it anyway. So today I've scraped up my thoughts on Robodemons, an unlicensed NES game that objectively appears terrible, but managed to captivate me on many levels regardless.
Robodemons.
I mean, listen to that. Who needs a seal of quality anyways? So this came out in 1990 in North America, developed and published by Color Dreams, a company known for releasing several unlicensed NES games on those cute baby blue cartridges. You might also know their other sub-labels like Bunch Games or Wisdom Tree, their branch for religious edutainment titles that actually sold fairly well. But one thing you could always count on was raw and ragged gameplay, abrasive music and sound, weird outsider pixel art. Robodemons would be no exception to this. It even also serves as their dark and sinister alternative to their top-selling title Bible Adventures. Beneath the pretty sick-looking cover art, we've got a tale surrounding a most great warrior who has taken on the task of stopping the evil demon king Cole from taking over planet Earth with his army of Robodemons. You must fight through the 7 gates of Hades, destroy Cole's contraption that can transplant demon souls into machines, and ultimately take down Cole himself in his grand palace, only armed with a boomerang and a jetpack. So the gameplay switches between rudimentary shoot-'em-up sections and platforming, all with the same haunting, melancholic tune in the background. The shmup levels have no terrain to speak of. The first level has rows of skulls, spiderwebs, and gravestones to wall off the edges of the screen, and you'll slowly jet forward through a handful of skull turrets and other skull things, awkwardly throwing boomerangs until you defeat the mini-boss, Death, and then finally enter the level of Bone. At least the graphics here get a little more interesting for our first platforming level, dropping us into a multi-level graveyard with a chaotic tile set of skeletal remains. The side-scrolling controls are pretty floaty. I guess you could say the jumping feel could be described as Luigi-like, with that same kind of slipperiness and floatiness that he had in Mario 2, which doesn't feel great here, but you can certainly adapt to it reasonably quickly. And since you can only have one boomerang on the screen at a time, not to mention its trajectory does not have it return directly to you, but above you instead, this becomes your first playground to learn how to deal with the numerous skeleton enemies in your path, along with dealing with deadly hazards on the ground and slowly roving teeth. Like several of the other side-scrolling sections, you have to find a key to gain entry to the exit, while other doors may teleport you around within the level. The multi-layered layout shows some ingenuity in its efficiency here, as they only had to design and load one stage, but you have to go back and forth through it multiple times with a slightly different experience due to the enemy respawns. It's actually kinda smart design with such limited resources. And our next level of hell is the level of Flesh. Again, starting off with another shmup section, showing off some new goofy enemies, and at this point in your gameplay you might notice these moments to be a crucial place to refresh on health if you can. And then we'll move on to one of the wildest looking levels I've ever seen in an unlicensed game. A messy network of internal organs and arteries, having you jump on platforms made of brains and guts, traversing through teleporting ventricles, all while trying not to fall into a dangerous ocean of bile. A tremendous and memorable stage. Now, I won't go too deep into all of the other later levels here, because seriously, how can you top the level of flesh? But as you keep going, the challenge gradually ramps up with more enemies that take more hits to kill, and eventually new objectives like saving human prisoners. Each level really does make a commendable effort to stick to a certain theme, and we also constantly get introduced to new enemies. Even the Robodemon factory introduces a belt-scrolling playfield into the mix, and a task to destroy various objects within the factory. It's really an unexpected amount of variety for a game of this scale, and it weirdly just works somehow. But let's just gloss over the fact that a lot of the time you can easily jump over enemies to skip them. Finally, you'll face the evil Cull, who looks pretty rad but ultimately is too lazy to get out of his chair, and ends up being very easy to beat if you find a nice place to shoot from. This is by no means a hard game once you figure out how to outsmart some of the nastier enemies, and especially considering it has unlimited continues, this one could probably be bested in an afternoon. But honestly, it can be surprisingly fun to play again if you want to try to beat it without continuing, or maybe even speedrun it. Stacking this up against NES games with an actual production budget doesn't feel super fair, but if we're limiting our scope to the Color Dreams catalog, Robodemons is solid as hell. I still need to dig deeper into their other games. I've even threatened to try a Color Dreams challenge on my stream someday, but so far I can genuinely recommend this one to open-minded jank enjoyers. It may be cheap and rough around the edges, but something about it feels like some heart was put into this one, and maybe some flesh and bone too. Thanks so much for watching and supporting the channel, and we'll catch you next time. And it's the ultimate genre combination, ninja and golf. Yes, ninja is a game genre. No further questions. Welcome to Ninja Golf. Now, I won't pretend to be an expert on the Atari 7800. I've never had one. I've never even played on someone else's. And honestly, Ninja Golf is the only 7800 game I have yet to play. I'm sure I'll fix that someday, so there are a few that look pretty fun, but for now I'll have to assume it's all downhill from here, because this game rules. This was released in 1990 in North America, and one of the last titles to come out for the Atari 7800, a console that struggled to get much traction at a time when the NES was dominating the Western market, and the Sega Genesis was picking up steam in its first year of release there. There were also some Ninja Golf ports planned for Atari computers that were ultimately cancelled, so this would end up being an Atari 7800 exclusive developed by Blue Sky Software, who had also released a handful of other 7800 games at the time, and they would go on to do quite a few other computer games and a pretty solid roster of Sega console titles in the 90s, like Jurassic Park, Shadowrun, and Vector Man. Ninja Golf has also had a recent re-release and a dodgy-looking mobile game remake, but we'll get into that later. The game opens up with an appropriate and very silly lore dump for a Ninja Golf game, and you tee up on one of 9 holes to begin the true test of your years of ninja training. The screen layout has a large side-scrolling view of everything, and there's a small map of the hole in the lower left used for aiming your shots, and a HUD next to that with your score, health, remaining lives, and stock of throwing stars. Basically, you just aim and time your button press for the ideal distance, whack the ball, and start running after it. No need to futz around with picking a club or worrying about the wind, probably because you're a damn ninja. Of course, along the way, you'll be beating up other ninjas, weird mutant groundhog things, and giant frogs. And the sand traps also feature deadly snakes, and naturally, the water hazards are fully stocked with bloodthirsty sharks. Just a typical day on the course. And there are a few random items that appear and can be picked up as well, like health potions, extra lives, more throwing stars, or temporary shields. Once you finally reach the green, you'll have to face off against a fire-breathing dragon guardian of the hole, with a behind-the-back view reminiscent of the bonus stage of the Shinobi arcade game. And you must dodge the dragon's projectiles while timing your own shots to hit it in the face. The Guardian's speed gets gradually increased the further you get, so these parts do get a little tricky later, but ultimately they're pretty predictable. Overall, this game doesn't get too tough while on easy or normal difficulty, but don't worry too much if you lose, as you'll only dishonor your family. Meanwhile, true ninjas out there can test their skills with hard mode or kamikaze mode, and in true classic Atari game fashion, you can also push yourself beyond simply beating the game by aiming for higher scores, with bonus points awarded for shooting par or better, along with killing enemies and grabbing power-ups. Or if you really like getting constantly kicked in the ass, consider the speedrun. Now granted, the game doesn't really have a ton of depth to it, but the path to mastery is there if you want it. Aside from its original release, it's also seen an official 7800 reprint by Atari recently, pretty reasonably priced too at $32.99. And it was also included in their Atari 50 compilation available on Steam and other modern platforms, and it plays just fine in that emulated version. Somewhat more regrettably, it also received a mobile game remake for iOS and Android in 2019, which has already since been delisted on both platforms. The concept is similar, but presented in 3D with a very generic aesthetic. It's fine for what it is, but it doesn't really have the same charm for me in this modernized version. But still, the original Ninja Golf, in its pure, campy, and janky form, against all odds I can safely say it's truly the best Ninja Golf game ever made. Maybe a bold statement considering how competitive that genre is, but I'm sticking to it. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time. With the massive success of Castlevania since its first entry in 1986, it's no surprise that other companies would make efforts to replicate the effective combo of difficult action platforming with a gothic horror setting. Similar experiences on the NES could be found in titles like Eight Eyes or Holy Diver, but Sega would also have their own Castlevania-like to throw into the mix with Master of Darkness, released on the Master System in Europe, and with scaled-down Game Gear versions in Japan and North America. The inspiration is pretty blatant from a quick glance, but while I was playing through the 8-bit Castlevania titles for my Castlevania challenge, I couldn't resist taking this little detour to see how Master of Darkness stacked up against them. One surprising detail here is how late this actually came out, with its various ports spread out across 1992 and 1993, so this is well after Castlevania 3's 1989 debut, and this is even after Super Castlevania 4 came out in 91. Castlevania didn't see any appearance on a Sega console until Bloodlines in 1994, so clearly they were starving for something to try and fill that horror platformer void. Development here was handled by Sims, a joint venture formed in 1991 between Sega and Sanritsu Denki, an experienced arcade game developer, and Sims would go on to be the company behind plenty of other solid Sega titles, like the Master System conversions of Alien Storm and Ninja Gaiden, or the Genesis port of Shadow Dancer, just to name a few. So it's got a fairly capable crew behind it here, although one clearly focused on efficiency and quantity of releases, considering the vast number of conversions and ports they were pumping out. So I guess it's not shocking for this to look and feel like a port of Castlevania, while still keeping things legally distinct, of course. The story here puts you in the role of the psychologist Dr. Social, who receives a message on his Ouija board to investigate some murders in London, finding Jack the Ripper to blame, but soon finding out it's part of a demonic ritual to resurrect Count Dracula. So at least the setting gives things a little bit of a fresh twist here, and there are some basic cutscenes sprinkled throughout that add a nice bit of relevance to your actions as you make your way through the game's 5 stages. The gameplay is essentially a straightforward action platformer in the vein of, you guessed it, Castlevania. I don't want to beat this into the ground, but the comparisons are unavoidable. but Master of Darkness does at least have a few minor differences to keep it from being a blatant bootleg. In the controls department, Dr. Social does have some mid-air jump control and can jump off of stairs if needed, but not onto them. He can fight off enemies with a variety of different weapons and sub-weapons, although unlike the upgradable whip mechanics, your various weapon pickups can actually be a detriment at times, such as picking up the tiny little dagger on accident when you could have kept the powerful axe. So you'll want to be a little careful gathering items from the masks that are dispersed throughout the levels. There are bombs and boomerangs for sub-weapons, which are mostly useful during boss fights, but it can be a bit tricky to use effectively otherwise. Your character also has a pretty generous amount of health available. Apparently psychologists are more tank-like than vampire hunters in this universe. This may have been an effort to balance difficulty, considering some fairly annoying monster behaviors in parts, but I might argue that it makes things a little bit too easy. You're probably more likely to lose lives from tricky platforming moments, and sometimes even forced to make blind jumps. One would think the condensed view on the Game Gear would make this borderline unplayable, but luckily the level design there was modified slightly to accommodate. The game's levels take you through London, a creepy house of wax, a cemetery leading you to Count Massin's castle, where he's performing the rituals to resurrect Dracula, and finally a dungeon labyrinth within Dracula's own castle. The atmosphere is appropriately spooky, and it has a nice variety to the locales, some of which feeling very familiar to Castlevania veterans. The level design is alright. There are occasional branching paths here and there that may lead to helpful item caches, there's tons of stairs, and some little platforming pieces like the boats or the clock tower pendulums. The final stage is probably the most interesting, with a full-on maze that you have to figure out, and it's nothing too overwhelming, and a nice addition to further pull itself apart from its inspiration. The boss fights are also pretty cool, given further impact with those cutscenes to give more context and weight than just battling random Halloween monsters. Overall, the game is sadly pretty short. I found it was a pretty easy clear within a few hours of my first time playing it, really only hitting some snags with some of the brutal jumps here and there. I'd welcome a hard mode on this one, or if I ever give it another go, I might try for a deathless or maybe a speedrun sometime. And I hope my constant Castlevania comparisons aren't coming off the wrong way here. Despite it being a very derivative game, it's still very fun. It looks and sounds good for a Master System game, and it just may have come out a few years too late to be a serious competitor in the horror platforming sphere at the time. So all in all, it's a very solid Master System title worth a try sometime, especially for Classicvania fans. And maybe another game to look at on the system might have to be Conceited, which I haven't tried yet myself, but looks like a solid Castlevania-like experience, but with a Japanese setting, loaded with yokai, which seems like a great idea to me. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video today. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel, and we'll catch you next time. The PlayStation is home to a pretty substantial amount of pinball video games, a genre near and dear to my heart. And the selection of PS1 pinball has some pretty good stuff. Some great ones, some groovy ones, but we're gonna get truly unhinged here today with Paranoiascape. Certainly the most bizarre and twisted pinball game I've ever played on any system. Trypophobic folks out there might want to avoid this one. Now, this was released in 1998, exclusively in Japan, published by Mathilda, and seemingly the only PS1 game they ever made. But development was by Jorudan, a studio which started up in 1991 and has some interesting stuff in their past body of work, including some Super Nintendo dank jank like Zardion and Musia, and lots of hamster games on handhelds. In these days, they seem to be keeping in business by managing a public transportation website. But the main creative force behind Paranoiascape is Screaming Mad George, a special effects artist infamous for his grotesque practical effects, and with a pretty incredible resume of films he's been involved with, including Predator, Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and 4, Society, Freaked, and also co-directed the live-action Guyver movie. Now, this would be his first and only video game project, but his talents for twisted and surreal body horror are displayed in full force here, as he was in charge of the game's direction, creature design, and even the soundtrack, pulling from his punk roots in the late 70s. While one might expect him to make some kind of weird survival horror game or something, instead his vision would be to create a pinball game, but with an unusual first-person perspective that has you moving your pair of skeletal flippers through various fleshscapes and nightmarish realms, with different stages offering up various objectives to progress forward, all while trying to keep your brain ball in play and managing the health bar of the two flying skeleton dudes you're guiding around. Now, there are 3 stages total, but they're split up into 3 smaller parts each, with environments ranging from pulsating pathways adorned with alien creatures and writhing mouths, to intestinal tracts leading to rivers of bile. And sometimes you just need to push forward through the stage to the end, but sometimes there may be some kind of larger boss-type monster that needs to be defeated, like a glowing wireframe bug, and whatever this is. Or sometimes the goal may be a bit more unclear, especially if you can't read the Japanese instructions preceding the levels. But it's still an interesting bit of variety beyond the usual pinball gameplay of just trying for a good score. But hey, there's that too. You can still earn bonus points per stage, and there's methods to exponentially increase the bonuses with some skilled play. Now, executing skilled play is certainly a bit tough at first, with some rather odd physics and very jank collision and hitboxes all around, but the real star of the show here is the visuals. Everything is just so unusual and unsettling. It's a unique blend of body horror and psychedelia, accompanied by an abrasive industrial rock soundtrack, and everything is just undeniably screaming mad George. The game may feel like it's held together by duct tape at times, but you have to commend that he stuck to his vision and wasn't afraid to get weird and experimental here. It's also a pretty short game. It's easily finished within an hour or less, which in some cases could be a complaint, but I think extending the experience much more might wear thin pretty fast. I was certainly perplexed by the final stage, which no longer has the pinball approach, but instead you move around this creepy doll, avoiding zombies and finding king and queen dolls, putting them into a bed, establishing a new life in this surreal world. Really makes you think. It's too bad Screaming Mad George never made another game. Based on the to be continued here, it seems like he might have wanted to, but Paranoiascape would drift off into obscurity and now just exists as a rare oddity in the PS1 library. Now, if you're into bizarre horror or totally wild takes on pinball, I would absolutely suggest giving this a play sometime. It does at least have 3 difficulty modes, which is nice to set to easy if you want to just see the weird levels, but hard mode definitely offers up a nice challenge in case you come to grips with the gameplay itself. And if you like the first-person pinball concept, the closest matching game I can think of would have to be Dank, a 3DO game I covered in an overlooked A to Z video if you haven't watched that yet. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this little oddball game today. Thanks so much for watching and supporting the channel. It really means a lot. We'll catch you next time. So I'm a sucker for gory 80s anime, spooky adventure games, giant monster sprites, and weird genre hybrids. So when I first stumbled across this game in my never-ending research on old horror games, my fascination soon followed. This is Ankoku Shinwa, Yamato Takeru Densetsu, also known in English as The Dark Myth. Ankoku Shinwa originated as a 7-chapter serial manga from Shonen Jump in 1976 by Daijiro Morohoshi, known for his work in sci-fi and horror comics like Yokai Hunter and The Mudmen, and he's still releasing works to this day, and has been cited as influencing famous directors like Hideaki Anno and Hayao Miyazaki. Despite a prolific manga career, Ankoku Shinwa would be the only one of his works to get a video game adaptation, or even an animated version, with a 2-episode animated OVA series in 1990, and the game releasing on MSX in 1988, with a quite similar port to Famicom in 1989. Now, I can't pretend that either of these anime or game adaptations are well regarded, for reasons we'll get into, but potentially of interest for intrepid explorers of jank, looking for an obscure, weird, and mysterious story steeped in dark folklore and mythology. So the premise surrounds a 13-year-old boy named Takeshi, haunted by the mysterious death of his father. Upon deeper investigations, he soon discovers he is a descendant of the legendary prince and folk hero Yamato Takeru, and destined to become the avatar for a powerful god if he can complete his spiritual journey and gain that divine power. The adventure becomes quite convoluted and messy from there in the abridged anime and game adaptations, especially so for Western audiences that might not be familiar with the various folklore references blended together here, but at the very least it gives off a mystical and somewhat archaeological vibe to everything, and even some cosmic horror Lovecraftian parallels can be observed here, like in much of Morohoshi's other works. The MSX and Famicom releases of Ankoku Shinwa were both developed by Zap and published by Tokyo Shoseki, and as mentioned, seem quite similar to each other. I'll mainly be showing off the Famicom port today, thanks to it having an English fan translation, but it's worth mentioning the MSX version arguably has an ever so slight edge in graphics and music quality. Zap, at the time, had a modest back catalog of MSX games under their belt since 1984, and they're also credited with some work on Azteca 2, which would go on to be westernized as Tombs and Treasure, another similar archaeological adventure game that would get released on Famicom and NES. Now, while Tombs and Treasure had a massive array of commands, Ankoku Shinwa has a more stripped down and minimal interface, limited to 6 action commands like move, use, speak, and so on, and a sprite-based inventory in the upper right, and a pretty cool journal progress indicator that helps you know if your decisions are putting you on the right track. Typical of adventure games of the time, there's a lot of trial and error of trying different things to keep the game moving along, sometimes resulting in your demise, although I wouldn't say it's as brutal as something like Shadowgate, where almost everything is out to kill you. The game's also split up into different chapters, so a death doesn't cause too much progress to be lost, and you can also obtain a password between chapters if you split up your play sessions on this one. And notably, at the end of each chapter is a boss fight, where the gameplay style switches to an action game, arming Takeshi with a projectile shooting sword and pitting you against some kind of giant monster in a very minimalistic dark room, which was likely a technical workaround to be able to handle the large sprites here. Your sword gradually improves throughout the game as well, so the weird lobbing shot you start out with will eventually become a much more useful spread shot attack, which is kind of a cool thing, but it also makes the game feel somewhat unbalanced as the bosses seem to just get easier as you get further in the game. Not that any of these action sequences are that hard anyway, it's fairly straightforward pattern recognition and exploiting safe spots for these fights. So yeah, these parts are a bit janky, but an interesting mix-up that you don't see in many adventure games at the time. And I thought some of the monsters were pretty awesome looking, and they cap off each chapter nicely. The game in total is fairly short, and with its fairly limited choices of actions available, it's somewhat unlikely to get super stuck on any of its puzzles. Your first playthrough might only take a couple of hours, which can actually be kind of great if you're not looking for a lengthy experience. The English translation patch out there is pretty decent. It uses rather basic and awkward language at times, but it's at least very functional to get you through the game. I can't really speak to its translation accuracy, but it seems like the confusing plot is not isolated to the game adaptation, as the anime OVAs have similar issues, perhaps even more so, as the 2 episodes are constantly rushing to dump lore on you and deprioritizing showing action that is actually happening. I still thought it was worth watching though, and perhaps helps clarify some of the events and themes of the game. The manga also has been translated to English, which I haven't read through entirely yet, but maybe that would be a better place to start if you wanted a more complete understanding of the overall vision being shared here. I'm definitely curious to dig more into Morohoshi's work now, and after this video, maybe some of you out there might like to at least give the game a shot. Again, it's by no means an amazing title, but undeniably interesting if you're into this sort of stuff, and I quite like the aesthetics and the moody soundtrack. At the least, you could also check out Tombs and Treasure for a similar but more complex and polished mystical adventure title of a similar ilk. Thanks so much for watching and supporting the channel, and we'll catch you next time. We live in an amazing time in gaming history when people are still making fresh games for old and sometimes very niche consoles. And today is no exception with the recent release of a brand new beat-em-up made for the Neo Geo, Vengeance Hunters. Developed by an Alua studio specifically for running on that powerful arcade-focused hardware, luckily it's also available on PC and other modern console platforms, and fans of the genre are definitely going to want to check out this authentic arcade experience with a very juicy retro aesthetic and immensely satisfying action. The story of Vengeance Hunters takes place in a post-apocalyptic dystopia, where corporations have drained the world's resources, leaving behind a wasteland mess infested with disgusting mutants, diseased zombies, vicious punks, and deranged tech bros, and harboring an unlikely family of 3 heroes who have been pushed to the point of an uncontrollable thirst for vengeance. You and a potential second player can pick from Candy, Golem, and Looney, each with their own unique playstyle and moveset. Common controls between all 3 include light and hard attacks, jumping with generous mid-air maneuvering, the ability to dash, and a button for each character's signature skill. Each also has a health-draining desperation attack, with an additional mechanic here that allows for regaining that lost health if you can manage to keep damaging more enemies without getting hit. Last but not least, they all have a wide array of combos and attacks that will frequently launch your enemies into the air, where you can maximize your damage output even further as you juggle them into oblivion. Beyond the basics of combat, each character has their own fighting style that really keeps gameplay fresh upon multiple playthroughs. Candy plays the fastest of the 3, with a signature cartwheel move that's not only great for navigating out of bad situations, but also to initiate extensive juggling combos or a devastating ground stab. But her high speed does come at the cost of having the lowest health capacity of the team. Looney, the scientist, takes to the field with a cybernetic combat arm with a super useful long-range fissile attack. Great for keeping enemies at bay from a distance, keeping them up in the air, and of course keeping them on the ground, dead. And finally, we have Golem, an orphaned kid merged into an advanced war machine, and notably the only character that can grab and throw enemies, with a wide array of suplexes, body slams, pile drivers, and even air throws. I should also mention that amongst the usual health and score drops typical of beat-em-ups, there are 3 different floating turret weapons you can find, including a machine gun, flamethrower, and missile launcher. There's not a ton of variety there, but you won't find me complaining about picking one up and laying waste to everything on the screen. And luckily, all of these cool moves are not going to go to waste on brain-dead and boring enemies, as we've got a really nice variety of them here with their own distinct behaviors and attacks, putting you in all sorts of different dangerous situations depending on the combinations of mobs coming for you, and perhaps even some environmental hazards in the mix as well. And things can get hectic as hell the further in the game you get, or if you've cranked up the difficulty setting. There's also, of course, an end boss for each of the levels, some of which having some of my favorite sprite designs in the game, but also introducing their own dirty tricks and attack gimmicks that you'll have to deal with. Notably, they don't usually rely much on adding hordes of other enemies to make it more challenging, but instead you'll need to learn their patterns and cycles to strike them at opportune moments. There are 5 levels total, each with their own very unique vibe and atmosphere, and also very well paced and never feeling overly long and stretched out like some other beat-em-ups can be guilty of. Further breaking up the action nicely are a few tongue-in-cheek minigames scattered about, which are helpful for getting a few extra lives, or maybe if you just need to be reminded, who's the master? There are also even secret areas to uncover, and one secret item to be found per stage, with an achievement and special game mode unlocked if you can find them all. Difficulty-wise, there are 3 modes available from the start: Prey, Hunter, and Vengeance, so there's a nice range of experiences depending on your proficiency with the genre. And clearing the hardest mode will also unlock an absurdly tough Expert mode with one-hit death. And you can't credit feed in this game either, with a limited number of continues available to make you put in a little more effort to see the game to its glorious finish. The game overs never felt too discouraging to me though, as the previously mentioned pacing, reasonable length of the game, and character variety make repeat playthroughs an absolute pleasure. And I know I'm definitely coming back to this one to find all the secrets and snag that 1cc on hard mode someday. Overall, I really recommend picking this up if you're into the beat-em-up genre, or just fun arcade games in general. This may be the first outing from Nalua Studio, but their experience and love for the Neo Geo really shines here, and I can't wait to see what they come up with next. I should also mention, for those looking to play this on real hardware, it was 100% designed with running on the Neo Geo in mind and targeting 60 frames per second, with a nearly identical experience to what's available on PC and modern consoles, just with some very rare and slight instances of slowdown and minor differences in sound quality. But regardless of what platform you play it on, I hope you get out there and enjoy some delicious vengeance. Thanks for watching, and if you're new here, stick around for coverage of all sorts of Dank games, new and old. And we'll catch you next time.
Sweet.
Horror fans, prepare yourselves. Your favorite iconic super fiends have all been rounded up in a fresh new NES game. The latest project from Vista Productions, aka 8-Bit Slasher. This is All Hell Unleashed. So this developer got their start making click-and-play fan games in the late 90s, paying tribute to Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and Candyman, and would eventually create some very fun NES demakes of these in 2022 and 2023. Not to mention other original homebrew games for the console, like the Arm Wrestling Challenge, Plummet Challenge, and Carpet Shark. This new work from them, just released in April of 2025, builds upon their experience and spins up an epic love letter to 80s retro horror franchises in their most fleshed out adventure yet. The premise for the game surrounds an evil cult determined to unleash hell upon the world by summoning the ultimate squad of villains through a dimensional rift, and it's up to you to face off with each of them and reassemble a magical amulet necessary to seal off these baddies for good. Early on in development, 8-Bit Slasher debated upon which horror franchise to tackle for the next game, and instead went for the why not all approach with 10 of them. In any order, you can take on Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Candyman, Scream, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Child's Play, It, Hellraiser, and Killer Clowns from Outer Space, each with their own levels split into 2 parts, and of course a boss fight against the corresponding villain themselves. The gameplay takes an action platforming approach here, with a pretty classic setup for running and jumping around, and has some tight controls paired with a brisk movement speed and mid-air jumping adjustment. On the attacking side of things, you can switch between 3 different weapons at any time with unlimited use of each, including a basic throwing knife, which can be fired quickly but with limited range and damage output. You've also got a brass knuckle knife, which does twice as much damage and can pass through blocks, but is considerably slower, and you can only have one on the screen at once. And finally, you've got Molotov cocktails, the most powerful attack, which is also necessary to break through certain blocks, but can be awkward to use due to its arcing trajectory. As far as level structure goes, the first sections require you to find 8 different orbs scattered throughout in order to open up a portal to the next section, all while dealing with various enemies and hazards. And you've got 5 health points per life, with an unlimited number of continues. Each of the levels feature locales from the movie they are paying tribute to, along with some wonderful 8-bit renditions of their movie themes, and we're treated to some absolute bangers like the funky Friday the 13th 3 theme, or even the weird creepy atmospheres of Texas Chainsaw Massacre are represented. And let's not forget the absolute classic tune from Killer Clowns. The soundtrack is just a ton of fun, and reverence to the source material comes through in the background artwork and unique crew of enemies per stage as well. The second sections of the stages are much shorter, but they pit you against a handful of cultists guarding the portal to the boss room. Each one of these areas also features a damsel in distress that you can rescue or accidentally kill. Rescuing them will refill your life bar, killing them will hurt you, so be on the careful side, especially considering the ending you get can be affected by your actions here. Eventually you'll go head to head with the boss of the stage, each with their own unique attack patterns and behavior, and all of them only have brief moments of vulnerability when you can actually do damage to them. The patterns are generally somewhat simple to figure out and deal with accordingly, but some of them do have some very fun little details, like knocking Jason's mask off, or other cameos and references peppered throughout the fights. And finally, upon clearing all 10 levels and reassembling the amulet, you'll enter a climactic showdown with the King of Hell himself, and hopefully send him packing. Overall, the game isn't super long, especially since you get unlimited lives and generous checkpoints, and your first playthrough might only take an hour or so, but I still think it's a really fun and satisfying experience for horror fans, and there can be more to do if you want to dive deeper. Some extra features include a boss rush mode, which can be a nice way to practice those fights if you like, and there are some helpful instructions and even a little training room screen to practice your controls. And much like this dev's other fan games, there are a handful of Easter eggs to find, and quite a few not-so-secret codes to play around with, which are all listed on the game's itch.io page if you want to try them out. Code highlights include an absurd mode, which changes the game to a one-hit-and-you're-dead situation, which is a great option to scale up the difficulty, especially if you want to up the stakes even further and try to beat the game deathless. Or if you just want to get silly, there is a disrobe mode, complete with 8-bit naughty bits. Beyond that, I also feel there's potential for a fun speedrun here as well, and I hope to try a few more runs of this myself at some point. Overall, I really recommend checking this out, and especially at the astoundingly reasonable price of free, so there isn't much of an excuse not to. Admittedly, it is certainly lacking some polish in some aspects, but it's undeniable to see that a lot of passion was put into this over its 15-month development cycle, especially considering there's no chance for financial return involved here, since it's pulling inspiration from a lot of different IPs. In the end, it's pretty inspiring to see how this dev has grown and evolved over the years, and I'd say this is a project to be proud of. They claim this to be their swan song, but I wish them the best in whatever creative endeavors come next. And thanks for watching, folks. Again, you can download the ROM of this game for free from their itch.io page, and the link will be in the description. And if you're looking for more homebrew horror games on the NES, check out my previous video digging into a bunch of them, including the previous works by 8-Bit Slasher. And we'll catch you next time.